To the casual observer, the conflict between Israel and Palestine may appear to be just another geopolitical struggle, one more chapter in the long history of territorial disputes and political rivalries. For politicians, analysts, and diplomats, it's a war of borders, national identity, and historical grievances. Maps are drawn and redrawn. Treaties are made and broken. Lives are lost, and peace remains elusive. But for Christians, especially those who read the Bible with spiritual eyes, this conflict is something much deeper. It's not just a battle over land. It's a spiritual war that has been raging for thousands of years, one that traces its roots back to the very heart of Scripture, to ancient prophecies and divine promises that still echo today. Long before the world knew of modern Israel or the Palestinian territories, there were promises made by God to Abraham, promises about land, descendants, and a chosen nation. There was a covenant that marked a people set apart, and with it came both blessing and opposition. The tension between Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, was more than sibling rivalry. It was a spiritual foreshadowing of deeper divisions that would span generations and empires, from the rise of ancient kingdoms to the destruction of the temple. From Roman occupation to modern-day wars, the land known as Israel has always carried spiritual weight. Prophets spoke of its destiny. Kings ruled and fell within its borders. And at the center of it all is Jerusalem, a city sacred to Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike. But for Christians, it holds a special place. It's where Jesus walked, where he was crucified, and where many believe he will return. This is why the conflict strikes a chord so deep within the hearts of believers. Because it's not just about politics or property, it's about prophecy. It's about the unseen forces at work behind what the world calls news. While governments may argue over land rights and ceasefires, many Christians understand this conflict as part of a much larger spiritual narrative, a war between darkness and light, truth and deception, God's promises and the forces that seek to oppose them. So when we look at Israel and Palestine, we must look with both natural eyes and spiritual discernment. The struggle is real on the ground, but it is just as real in the heavenly realms. And as followers of Christ, we are called not only to understand, but to pray for peace, for justice, and for God's will to be done on earth, as it is in heaven. This story doesn't begin in the 20th century, or even with the fall of the Ottoman Empire. It begins in the pages of Genesis, where God makes a covenant with Abraham, promising him descendants as numerous as the stars and a land for his offspring to dwell in. But almost immediately, division enters the story. Abraham's sons, Ishmael and Isaac, become symbols of two diverging paths, one marked by promise, the other by conflict. From that moment on, the tension we see today begins to take shape. The descendants of Isaac, through Jacob, would become the nation of Israel. The descendants of Ishmael would become many Arab nations. And while Scripture says God blessed both lines, the spiritual inheritance, the covenant, was passed down through Isaac, sparking jealousy, division, and a centuries-long struggle over identity, inheritance, and divine favor. As we move through history, we see this conflict play out not just between individuals, but between kingdoms and empires. The Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, exiled to Babylon, oppressed by the Greeks and Romans. And yet, despite every effort to erase them from history, they remained. Prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel foretold of Israel's dispersion and their eventual return to the land. And in 1948, after nearly 2 millennia, that prophecy became reality. But the return of the Jewish people to their ancestral homeland reignited the flame of ancient tensions. For the Palestinian people, many of whom had lived on that land for generations, it felt like displacement, loss, and betrayal. Two peoples, both with deep ties to the same land. Two histories, two narratives colliding again in our time as believers. We must be careful not to dehumanize either side. While prophecy gives us perspective, we must never lose compassion. These are real people, families, children, communities caught in the middle of a spiritual and geopolitical storm. Our role is not to take sides politically, but to stand for truth, to pray for peace, and to understand the times we're living in through the lens of Scripture. In the coming moments, we'll trace this epic story from Eden to Armageddon, from ancient scrolls to breaking news headlines. So get ready. What you're about to discover may challenge your perspective, deepen your faith, and reveal just how closely the Bible and today's headlines are intertwined. Let's begin. The roots of the Israel-Palestine conflict trace back thousands of years to the Bible's account of Abraham and his two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Abraham, considered the patriarch of both Jews and Arabs, was promised by God that his descendants would inherit the land of Canaan. However, the story of who would inherit this promise is where the divide begins. Abraham had two sons, Ishmael, born to Hagar, an Egyptian slave, and Isaac, born to his wife Sarah in their old age. According to the Bible, God's covenant would be passed through Isaac and his descendants, making Isaac the father of Jacob, whose descendants became the Israelites. This divine promise of land and blessing to Isaac and his descendants is central to the Jewish claim to the land of Israel. Genesis 17:19-21. But Ishmael also received a blessing from God. In Genesis 16:10-12, God promised that Ishmael would become the father of a great nation. Ishmael's descendants are traditionally understood to be the Arab people, which includes the Palestinians. This ancestral division sets the stage for the conflict, as both Jews and Arabs claim Abraham as their forefather and see the land of Canaan as part of their heritage. The heart of the Israel-Palestine conflict is the claim to the land of Israel, which both sides consider their rightful homeland. For Jews, the land is not just a place to live, it's a fulfillment of a divine promise, God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob includes the land of Canaan, modern-day Israel and Palestine, as an everlasting inheritance for their descendants. Genesis 15:18-21. This promise is reaffirmed throughout the Old Testament, particularly in God's covenants with Moses and King David. The Bible also speaks of the restoration of Israel in the end times, with prophecies in Ezekiel 37 and Isaiah 66 describing a future where Israel is regathered from exile and restored to its land. These prophecies were seen by many as being fulfilled in 1948, when Israel became a nation after nearly 2,000 years of exile. Following the horrors of the Holocaust for Palestinians, many of whom trace their lineage to Ishmael and view themselves as descendants of the ancient Canaanites and other peoples of the region. The land is their ancestral home as well. They have lived in the region for centuries, and their connection to the land runs deep. This tension over land ownership creates a complex and emotionally charged dispute that goes beyond mere politics. It touches on identity, faith, and historical rights. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 marks one of the most pivotal and controversial moments in modern Middle Eastern history. It was a moment of jubilation for the Jewish people, symbolizing the fulfillment of ancient prophecies and the restoration of their homeland after centuries of exile. But for Palestinians, this moment signified the beginning of an enduring displacement and loss, sparking what they call the Nakba, the catastrophe. Understanding the profound impact of 1948 requires a deep dive into the historical, political, and emotional elements that have shaped the Israel-Palestine conflict as we know it today. To grasp the significance of 1948, we must first understand the factors that led to the creation of the State of Israel. The modern conflict between Jews and Arabs in Palestine began to take shape in the late 19th century with the rise of the Zionist movement. Founded by Theodor Herzl in 1897, Zionism advocated for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in response to centuries of persecution, including pogroms in Eastern Europe and Russia. Palestine at that time was under Ottoman control and home to a predominantly Arab Muslim population, with smaller Christian and Jewish communities. However, the Zionist movement viewed Palestine as the historic homeland of the Jewish people. Based on biblical claims and historical ties to the land of Israel. From the early 1900s, Jewish immigration to Palestine increased steadily, fueled by Zionist aspirations and the growing dangers Jews faced in Europe. This immigration was further accelerated by the Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which the British government expressed its support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The declaration, while welcomed by Jews, sowed the seeds of conflict with the Arab inhabitants of the region. They viewed the declaration as a betrayal by the British, who had previously promised Arab independence in exchange for support against the Ottoman Empire during World War I. After the defeat of the Ottomans in 1918, Britain was given control over Palestine under a League of Nations mandate, a move that formalized its role in administering the region. During this period, Jewish immigration and land purchases continued to increase, resulting in growing tensions between Jews and Arabs. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, these tensions escalated into sporadic violence between Jewish and Arab communities in Palestine. Both groups felt a deep attachment to the land, and the competing nationalist movements, Zionism for Jews and Arab nationalism for Palestinians, began to clash more openly. In the 1930s, as Jewish immigration surged, particularly due to the rise of Nazi Germany, Palestinian Arabs grew increasingly alarmed. Many Palestinians feared that the growing Jewish population would soon dominate the land, leading to calls for limits on immigration and Jewish land purchases. These fears reached a boiling point during the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, a widespread uprising against both the British administration and Jewish communities. The revolt was violently suppressed by the British, but it deepened Palestinian resentment and strengthened the Jewish community's desire for self-defense. The tragic events of World War II and the Holocaust added urgency to the Zionist cause. The systematic extermination of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany left the surviving Jewish population determined to create a homeland where they could live safely and free from persecution. For many Jews, Palestine was the only place that could serve as this refuge. After the war, tens of thousands of Jewish refugees, many of them Holocaust survivors, sought to immigrate to Palestine. However, the British, facing increasing Arab opposition and their own geopolitical challenges, imposed limits on Jewish immigration. This led to Jewish paramilitary organizations like the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi launching violent campaigns against British forces. demanding an end to immigration restrictions and British rule. The British, exhausted from the war and unable to manage the growing violence, referred the issue of Palestine to the newly formed United Nations in 1947. In response to the rising violence between Jews and Arabs, the United Nations proposed a solution, the Partition Plan of 1947. The plan aimed to divide Palestine into two separate states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem placed under international administration due to its religious significance to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. According to the UN Partition Plan, 55% of the land would be allocated to the Jewish state. 45% of the land would go to the Arab state. Jerusalem would remain under international control. For Jews, who had long dreamed of a homeland, the partition plan was a victory, even though many felt that the land allocated to them was too small and fragmented. For Palestinians and the Arab world, the partition plan was seen as deeply unjust. At the time, Jews constituted only about 30% of the population and owned less than 10% of the land in Palestine. Yet, the plan gave them a majority of the territory, including some areas with large Arab populations. The Arab leadership rejected the partition plan outright, viewing it as a colonialist imposition that violated the rights of the indigenous Arab population. They believed that all of Palestine should be an Arab state, and that the growing Jewish presence was an illegitimate colonization project. Jewish leaders, led by David Ben-Gurion, accepted the plan with reservations, seeing it as the best opportunity to achieve statehood, even though it did not give them control over Jerusalem. On May 14, 1948, as the British mandate in Palestine came to an end, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. The next day, armies from 5 neighboring Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, invaded the new state, aiming to crush it before it could take root. This was the beginning of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, known in Israel as the War of Independence, and to Palestinians as the Nakba, Arabic for catastrophe. While Israel fought for its survival, the consequences for the Palestinians were devastating. During the war, over 700,000 Palestinians were displaced, either fleeing their homes out of fear or being forcibly expelled by Israeli forces. Entire Palestinian villages were depopulated, and many were razed to the ground. These refugees fled to neighboring countries, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt, or to the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The causes of this mass displacement are still hotly debated. Israeli historians argue that many Palestinians fled voluntarily, anticipating a swift Arab victory, while Palestinian scholars emphasize the expulsions carried out by Jewish militias during military campaigns, such as Plan Dalet, which aimed to secure the borders of the new state. Regardless of the causes, the result was the same: an enormous population of stateless Palestinians and a deep sense of injustice that has fueled the conflict for decades. The 1949 armistice agreements, which ended the war, left Israel in control of 78% of historic Palestine. The remaining territories, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, were controlled by Jordan and Egypt, respectively, until the 1967 Six-Day War, when Israel captured these areas. The Nakba is not just a historical event for Palestinians. It is the defining trauma of their national identity. The displacement of 1948 created a Palestinian refugee crisis that persists to this day, with millions of Palestinians living in refugee camps in neighboring Arab countries, in the West Bank and Gaza, or scattered across the globe. The right of return, The demand that Palestinian refugees and their descendants be allowed to return to the homes they fled or were expelled from in 1948 remains one of the core issues of the Israel-Palestine conflict. For Palestinians, 1948 represents the loss of their homeland, the destruction of their society, and the beginning of their statelessness. Every year on May 15th, Palestinians commemorate Nakba Day, mourning the loss of their land and demanding recognition of their rights. The memory of the Nakba is a source of deep resentment and fuels the desire for justice, restitution, and statehood. The events of 1948 laid the foundation for the modern Israel-Palestine conflict. The establishment of Israel and the displacement of the Palestinian people created two opposing national narratives, one of triumph and restoration for Jews, and one of catastrophe and dispossession for Palestinians. These competing historical memories have shaped the collective identities of both peoples and have made the path to peace extraordinarily difficult. The Nakba remains at the heart of the Palestinian demand for self-determination, justice, and the right of return. While for Israelis, the War of 1948 symbolizes the fulfillment of a 2,000-year-old dream to return to their ancestral homeland and build a sovereign state. The legacy of 1948 continues to cast a long shadow over every attempt to resolve the conflict, with both sides seeing the events of that year as critical to understanding their present-day struggles. The Six-Day War of 1967 is one of the most decisive and transformative events in the modern Middle East, reshaping the geopolitical landscape of the region and laying the groundwork for the ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict. For Israel, the war resulted in a swift, overwhelming victory that expanded its territory and solidified its position in the region. For the Palestinians and neighboring Arab states, the war marked the beginning of an extended Israeli occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza Strip, and Golan Heights, a source of enduring conflict and international tension. The consequences of this brief but intense war have reverberated throughout the decades, influencing the political, social, and spiritual dimensions of the conflict. Understanding the Six-Day War and its aftermath is crucial to comprehending the roots of the Israel-Palestine conflict, as it fundamentally changed the landscape of the region and cemented issues that remain central today. The Six-Day War did not arise out of a vacuum, but was the culmination of escalating tensions between Israel and its neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, following the creation of Israel in 1948. These tensions were heightened by several key factors. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War, known to Israelis as the War of Independence and to Palestinians as the Nakba catastrophe, had left deep scars. Arab states, particularly Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, refused to recognize Israel's right to exist and remained committed to reversing the outcomes of 1948. Arab nationalism, spearheaded by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, aimed at uniting Arab states against Israel. The 1948 war left unresolved territorial disputes, particularly over the West Bank, controlled by Jordan, Gaza, controlled by Egypt, and the Golan Heights, part of Syria. In the years leading up to the Six-Day War, there were frequent skirmishes and border clashes between Israel and its neighbors, with tensions growing over control of these areas. Another precursor to the Six-Day War was the Suez Crisis of 1956, in which Israel, in coordination with Britain and France, invaded Egypt following Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal. Although Israel withdrew under international pressure, the war deepened animosity between Israel and Egypt and laid the groundwork for future conflict. The Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union also played a role. The Arab states, particularly Egypt and Syria, were supported by the Soviet Union, while Israel, despite receiving international arms and economic support from various countries, increasingly became aligned with the United States and Western powers. In May 1967, Nasser escalated the conflict by closing the Straits of Tehran to Israeli shipping, effectively blockading Israel's port of Eilat and cutting off vital maritime access to the Red Sea. Israel viewed this as an act of war, and international efforts to mediate the situation failed, faced with increasing threats from its neighbors, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq, and the military mobilization of Arab forces along its borders. Israel felt surrounded and vulnerable. On June 5, 1967, Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, marking the start of the Six-Day War. Israel's Air Force led the offensive, launching Operation Focus, a meticulously planned surprise attack that destroyed the majority of Egypt's air force while it was still on the ground. This left Egypt's military crippled and ensured Israel's air superiority throughout the conflict. Over the next 6 days, Israel fought on multiple fronts against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, achieving stunning victories. By the end of the war on June 10, 1967, Israel had achieved the following: captured the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, seized control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, captured the Golan Heights from Syria. But while Israel rejoiced, the rest of the region mourned. For many in the Arab world, the Six-Day War of 1967 was not just a military defeat, it was a spiritual and national humiliation. The loss of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights intensified Palestinian displacement and fueled a growing sense of injustice that would smolder for decades. Refugee camps expanded, resistance movements gained momentum, and peace seemed further away than ever. Yet from a biblical standpoint, many Christians viewed Israel's swift and overwhelming victory as the fulfillment of prophecy, a sign that God was still at work, preserving his covenant people and setting the stage for events foretold long ago. The return of Jerusalem to Jewish control was particularly significant. Jesus himself had spoken of Jerusalem being trampled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Luke 21:24. Was this a sign that those times were now drawing to a close? With Jerusalem back under Jewish governance for the first time in nearly 2,000 years, attention turned toward the Temple Mount, the most contested piece of real estate on earth. For Jews, it is the holiest site, the location of Solomon's and Herod's temples. For Muslims, it is home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, a site deeply revered in Islam. And for Christians, it's the setting of many of Jesus' teachings, miracles, and his ultimate sacrifice. This convergence of faiths in one city has made Jerusalem not just a political powder keg, but a spiritual epicenter. Every step taken, every stone moved in that city echoes through the halls of prophecy. And every conflict, every peace treaty, every shift in control is watched closely by believers around the world who understand that what happens in Jerusalem affects the whole world. Since 1967, attempts at peace have come and gone. Agreements have been signed, only to be broken. Borders have shifted. Leadership has changed, but the core issues remain painfully unresolved. And all the while, believers continue to look to the Bible for answers, knowing that in the end, this is not just a territorial conflict, It's a divine drama unfolding on the stage of history. The question is, are we watching with spiritual eyes? Are we discerning the signs of the times? Because Jerusalem, the city of peace, may also be the place where the final battle for peace is fought. The Six-Day War created a new reality. Israel now controlled significant Arab populations in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, beginning what is known as the Israeli occupation of these territories. Israel's capture of the West Bank and Gaza brought over 1 million Palestinians under Israeli military rule. This occupation has been one of the most contentious issues in the Israel-Palestine conflict, as Palestinians in these territories seek independence and the establishment of a Palestinian state. The occupation remains a point of deep international concern, particularly with the expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank. The capture of East Jerusalem and its unification with West Jerusalem was perhaps the most symbolic victory for Israel. The Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, came under Israeli control for the first time in nearly 2,000 years. However, for Palestinians and the broader Arab world, the loss of East Jerusalem was a major blow, as the city is also home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, two of the holiest sites in Islam. The capture of the Golan Heights from Syria has remained a strategic military advantage for Israel, providing a buffer zone against potential attacks from the north. However, the Syrian government continues to demand its return, making the Golan a key point of contention in Israeli-Syrian relations. The war exacerbated the Palestinian refugee crisis. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled or were displaced from the newly occupied territories, adding to the already significant number of refugees created during the 1948 Nakba. These displaced Palestinians have never been allowed to return, fueling resentment and further complicating peace efforts. Israel's victory in the Six-Day War was a result of not only its military strategy, but also the support and backing of various international allies. While Israel's primary military backer was the United States, other Western countries played key roles in providing funding, weapons, and diplomatic backing. Although the U.S. did not directly engage in the Six-Day War, it provided critical military and financial support to Israel in the lead-up to the conflict. U.S. Policy in the Middle East during the 1960s was shaped by the Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union. With the Soviet Union backing Arab states like Egypt and Syria, the U.S. saw Israel as a strategic ally in the region. The U.S. provides Israel with a wide array of military equipment, including aircraft, tanks, and artillery, as well as financial aid. The Israeli Air Force, which played a decisive role in the war, was equipped with American-made aircraft, including the French Mirage jets and American F-4 Phantom jets. The U.S. also provided diplomatic cover for Israel at the United Nations. While the U.S. called for a ceasefire during the war, it did not prevent Israel from achieving its objectives. Prior to the Six-Day War, France was Israel's most important arms supplier. France played a significant role in building Israel's military capabilities during the 1950s and early 1960s, including selling Mirage 3 fighter jets, which were pivotal in achieving Israel's air superiority. However, following the war, France distanced itself from Israel, aligning more with Arab states. Significant funding for Israel's military efforts also came from private Jewish organizations and diaspora communities around the world, particularly in the United States. Jewish communities raised money to help fund military equipment, humanitarian aid, and infrastructure for the new Israeli state. On the opposite side, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan were heavily backed by the Soviet Union, which supplied them with military training, arms, and financial assistance. The Soviet Union saw the Arab states as strategic partners in the Cold War struggle for influence in the Middle East and provided tanks, aircraft, and artillery to Arab forces. Despite this support, Arab military coordination was poor, and their forces were quickly overwhelmed by Israel's preemptive strike and superior military planning. The Six-Day War transformed the Middle East. Israel had not only secured its survival, but had expanded its borders significantly. However, the occupation of Palestinian territories, including the West Bank and Gaza, laid the foundation for decades of tension, uprisings, and cycles of violence. UN Resolution 242. Following the war, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 242, which called for the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict, and for the recognition of every state in the area to live in peace. While the resolution became the basis for future peace negotiations, its ambiguous wording, especially regarding the extent of Israeli withdrawal, left it open to multiple interpretations. To this day, the status of the occupied territories remains a central issue in the Israel-Palestine conflict. Settlement movement. In the aftermath of the war, Israeli settlements began to sprout in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. These settlements, viewed by the international community as illegal under international law, have expanded significantly over the decades, creating a demographic and political reality that complicates any potential for a two-state solution. Palestinian resistance. The Six-Day War also catalyzed Palestinian nationalism with the rise of movements like Fatah and the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, led by Yasser Arafat. These groups increasingly demanded the establishment of an independent Palestinian state and used both political means and armed struggle to achieve their goals. The occupation became a source of daily hardship for Palestinians and a rallying cry for resistance movements. The Six-Day War is more than just a military conflict. It's the event that reshaped the modern Middle East and defined the parameters of the Israel-Palestine conflict that persists today. Israel's rapid victory and subsequent occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem set the stage for decades of tension, resistance, and cycles of violence. The consequences of the war occupation, displacement, settlement expansion, and the continuing struggle for Jerusalem remain at the heart of the Israel-Palestine conflict, with both sides deeply entrenched in their positions. As we consider the events of 1967, it becomes clear that the Six-Day War was not just a flashpoint in history, but the moment that fundamentally altered the future of the Middle East. At the heart of the spiritual view of the Israel-Palestine conflict is the covenant that God made with Abraham and, by extension, with his descendants. This covenant is not only about the people of Israel, but also about a specific piece of land, the land of Canaan, which God promised to Abraham's descendants as an everlasting inheritance. In Genesis 12, 1-3, God promises Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. To your offspring I will give this land." This divine promise of land is reiterated in Genesis 15, 18, 21, where God specifies the boundaries of this land. Stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates, it was given to Abraham's descendants through Isaac, not as a temporary possession, but as an everlasting possession. Genesis 17, 7-8. This promise forms the foundation of Jewish claims to the land of Israel and Jerusalem, as they see themselves as the heirs of this covenant. For many Christians, this covenant remains active and significant in the modern era. The belief is that God's promises are eternal, and that the land of Israel was given to the Jewish people as part of His divine plan. Thus, any conflict over this land is not just about politics or territory. It's seen as an attempt to undermine God's covenant and thwart His plan for Israel and the world. Throughout the Old Testament, there are numerous prophecies about the scattering of the Jewish people, their exile, and their eventual restoration to the land of Israel. These prophecies speak of a time when Israel would be regathered from the nations and restored to their homeland, a process that many Christians believe began in the 20th century. One of the most significant prophecies comes from the book of Ezekiel. In Ezekiel 37, the prophet has a vision of a valley filled with dry bones, which represent the people of Israel. God tells Ezekiel that these bones will be brought back to life, a metaphor for the resurrection of the nation of Israel after centuries of exile. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones: I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord. Ezekiel 37:5-6. Later in the chapter, God declares, I will take the Israelites out of the nations where they have gone. I will gather them from all around and bring them back into their own land. Ezekiel 37:21. For many believers, the creation of the modern state of Israel in 1948 is a direct fulfillment of this prophecy. After nearly 2,000 years of exile, following the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, the Jewish people were regathered to their ancient homeland, just as the Bible foretold. This was seen as a miraculous event, one that signaled the beginning of the end times timeline. If Israel is central to God's prophetic plan, then Jerusalem is the crown jewel of that plan. The city of Jerusalem holds unparalleled significance in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But its biblical importance is especially highlighted in prophecy. Jerusalem is described as the city where God has placed His name and where He will dwell with His people. In 2 Chronicles 6:6, God says, But now I have chosen Jerusalem for my name to be there, and I have chosen David to rule my people Israel. Throughout the Bible, Jerusalem is depicted as the focal point of God's activity on earth. It's the place where Abraham nearly sacrificed Isaac, where David established his kingdom, and where Solomon's temple stood as a symbol of God's presence among His people in the New Testament. Jerusalem is the city where Jesus Christ was crucified and resurrected, making it central to the Christian faith as well. However, Jerusalem's role in prophecy extends beyond these historical events. The book of Zechariah speaks of Jerusalem's future role in the end times. In Zechariah 12:2-3, God declares that Jerusalem will become a source of conflict and global tension in the last days. I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. Judah will be besieged as well as Jerusalem on that day, when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her. I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. Zechariah 12:3 says, On that day, when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. All who try to move it will injure themselves. This powerful prophecy doesn't speak of a distant metaphor. It speaks of a reality that is unfolding before our very eyes. Today, Jerusalem is not just a local dispute, it is a global issue. The world's most powerful nations weigh in on its fate. peace summits, UN resolutions, and international negotiations continuously orbit around the question, who has the right to Jerusalem? And yet, no matter how many agreements are drafted, no matter how much pressure is applied, the conflict remains unresolved because what we're witnessing is not merely a political impasse, it's a spiritual resistance. Every attempt to divide, claim, or redefine Jerusalem's identity has been met with turmoil, diplomatic fallout, regional unrest, and at times, outright war. It is as if the city itself resists manipulation, just as Scripture foretold. For many Christians, this is not coincidence, it's divine confirmation. Jerusalem has a prophetic destiny, and no power on earth can override God's plan for it. This is why the city continues to draw the attention of kings, presidents, and religious leaders. Why a single decision like recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital can send shockwaves across the globe. Because behind the headlines, behind the flags and negotiations, is a battle between heaven and earth over a city chosen by God Himself. But as the world's focus intensifies on Jerusalem, so too must our spiritual discernment. The Bible makes it clear that Jerusalem will play a central role in the last days. It will be a cup of trembling to the nations, a flashpoint for global conflict, and ultimately, the place where the King of Kings will return. So, as believers, we don't watch the news with fear, but with understanding. We know that prophecy is not meant to scare us, but to prepare us. What's happening in Jerusalem is not the end, but the beginning of a greater unfolding. A reminder that God's word is alive, and His promises never fail. Stay with us as we continue this journey unpacking the prophecies, the history, and the future of Jerusalem, Israel, and the world stage. Because in the heart of the Middle East, the story of eternity is being written. The tension surrounding Jerusalem's status remains a key issue in the Israel-Palestine conflict, with both sides claiming it as their capital. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israel captured East Jerusalem, including the Old City, bringing the entire city under Israeli control for the first time in nearly 2,000 years. This event is viewed by many Christians as part of the prophetic restoration of Israel, as it brought the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, back into Jewish hands. However, it also intensified the conflict with Palestinians who see East Jerusalem as the capital of their future state. The Bible speaks of Jerusalem's central role in the final battles of the end times. The book of Revelation and other apocalyptic texts describe a series of wars and conflicts that will culminate in Armageddon, the ultimate confrontation between the forces of good and evil. According to these prophecies, Jerusalem will be the epicenter of these final battles. In Revelation 16:16 it is written, "Then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon." Armageddon, derived from the Hebrew Megiddo, refers to a valley near Jerusalem, which is traditionally viewed as the location of the final battle between the Antichrist and the forces of God. In this battle, Jerusalem will play a critical role as the city of God, where Christ will ultimately return to defeat His enemies and establish His millennial kingdom. The book of Zechariah also speaks of this final confrontation. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as He fights on a day of battle. On that day His feet will stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem. Zechariah 14:3-4. For Christians who view the Israel-Palestine conflict through a prophetic lens, the ongoing struggle over Jerusalem is a sign that these end-time events are drawing near. The battle for control over the city is seen as more than just a territorial dispute. It is part of a cosmic spiritual war between the forces of good and with the city at the heart of God's plan for the final redemption of the world. For many Christians and Jews who interpret the Israel-Palestine conflict as part of biblical prophecy, the war over the land is more than just a human conflict. It is a spiritual battle. According to this view, Satan seeks to destroy Israel and thwart God's plans for his chosen people. The rise of opposition to Israel, whether from Palestinian groups surrounding Arab nations or international critics, is often seen as part of this larger spiritual warfare. In the book of Daniel, for instance, we read about spiritual forces influencing earthly rulers and conflicts. Daniel speaks of angelic beings battling the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece, spiritual forces that represent the earthly powers of those nations. Many believe that similar spiritual forces are at work in the modern conflict over Israel, with demonic powers attempting to undermine God's purposes. Furthermore, the conflict over Jerusalem is seen as a microcosm of the larger spiritual battle between God's kingdom and the forces of darkness. For Christians, this struggle is not just about national sovereignty or political boundaries. It's about the culmination of God's plan to redeem the world through Christ, who will return to rule from Jerusalem and establish his eternal kingdom. The city of Jerusalem, with its profound religious significance, remains at the center of the political struggle. Israel's control over East Jerusalem, which Palestinians claim as the capital of their future state, has been a major sticking point in peace talks. The international community, including the United Nations, has not recognized Israeli sovereignty over East Jerusalem, viewing it as occupied territory. The two-state solution, which envisions an independent state of Palestine alongside the state of Israel, remains the most widely proposed solution to the conflict. And as this ancient conflict continues to dominate headlines and shape international policies, it serves as a sobering reminder that some battles are not easily resolved through diplomacy alone. Because at its core, this is not just a territorial dispute, it's a clash of identities, histories, and spiritual destinies. For the Jewish people, the land of Israel is more than homeland, it's covenant land, promised by God through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's the fulfillment of millennia-old prophecies that speak of return, restoration, and national rebirth. For Palestinians, many of whom have lived on this land for generations, it is their birthplace, their heritage, and the symbol of a long fight for recognition and statehood. Each side clings to a narrative rooted in suffering, survival, and a sense of divine or historical right. And so, the cycle of peace talks and broken agreements continues. International leaders come and go, each trying to broker a solution that can hold. But the deeper currents remain untouched. Because how do you negotiate something that is spiritually charged? How do you legislate prophecy? How do you draw borders through promises written in Scripture and etched in blood? Yet for believers, especially those who understand biblical prophecy, this struggle is not meaningless chaos. It's a part of a grand narrative that points toward a divine conclusion. The Bible tells us there will come a time when nations will be gathered against Jerusalem, when the world's powers will converge on this very land. But it also tells us that this will not be the end of Israel. It will be the beginning of something greater. Because after the turmoil, after the wars and rumors of wars, after the rise and fall of nations, a king will return. Not to New York, not to Rome, but to Jerusalem. The Prince of Peace will set his feet on the Mount of Olives, and the conflict that man could never solve will finally be brought to rest. Until that day, we are called to watch, to pray, and to prepare, to be peacemakers where we can, truth-bearers always, and people of hope in a world desperate for it. Because the story of Israel and Palestine is not just their story, it's ours too. A story of redemption, struggle, promise, and fulfillment. So keep watching. The headlines may be loud, but prophecy speaks louder. And in the heart of the Middle East, the stage is being set not just for the next chapter in human history, but for the return of the King. We believe understanding both the spiritual and political layers of this conflict is key not just for interpreting current events, but for recognizing the unfolding of God's bigger plan. Because what happens in Israel doesn't just stay in the Middle East, it ripples across the globe, touching hearts, shaking nations, and fulfilling words written thousands of years ago. If this video opened your eyes or challenged your thinking, we'd love to hear from you. How do you see the role of prophecy in today's world? Do you believe we're approaching the times spoken of by the prophets? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's grow and learn together as a community. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our upcoming episodes. In the next video, we'll take a deeper look into Jerusalem's prophetic future, including the significance of the Temple Mount, the talk of a third temple, and what it all could mean in light of biblical end-time events. Until then, stay rooted in the Word, stay watchful, and stay ready. The Bible is not just a history book, it's a roadmap for what's to come. Thanks for watching Deep Bible Studies. God bless you, and we'll see you in the next episode.